Hey, Daily Dosers. My name's Austin Payne. I'm one of the high school pastors here at North Coast. And a quick shout out to my Raider Nation. It's a hard week for us, and yet, yes, it is possible to follow Jesus and love the Raiders. But moving past that, we are in 1 Samuel chapter 17 in a very familiar story of David and Goliath. And yesterday, Chris Brown, he walked us through this statement that David says, because he has defied the armies of the living God. And what's the importance of the fact of the emphasis that we have a living God, and that what does it look like in our life that we follow that living God? Is he alive? Is he active in our life? And do we spend time with that living God? And how does that make a difference in our life? But I really want to focus on this next line that David says when he's reminiscing as he's talking to Saul about the ways that God has delivered him in the past. Right before that, he says, your servant's been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came off and carried off a sheep, I went after it and I struck it and I rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Which, by the way, that's bananas, right? Like, this is a moment in scripture, if you've heard this story before, which most of us probably have, it's really easy to breeze past stuff like this. But I love in scripture stories like Jonah and the whale, where if you grew up around the church, you go like, ah, yes, like Jonah and the whale, of course. But when was the last time you paused and really thought about the fact that a giant fish swallowed somebody? And then in Jonah chapter 2, there's this entire prayer between Jonah and God. And I have to pause and just kind of chuckle in scripture when you imagine Jonah sitting in the belly of a whale covered in acid and just going like, hey, God. Right? Like, that's a wild moment. This is another one of those crazy moments where David is reminiscing on his past, that when he was sitting with his flock and a lion came or a bear came, that he chases down this lion and this bear and he strikes it and he rescues the sheep from its mouth. He pulls it by its hair and kills it. Right? Like that is a wild picture right there. And then he says, this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he's defied the armies of the living God. And I love this very next verse. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine. See, David banks on his past experience with the faithfulness of God to dictate his current confidence in that God. I love even a couple chapters earlier in Samuel's farewell speech. He says this to the nation of Israel. He says, be sure, in chapter 12, verse 24, be sure to fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart. Consider what great things he has done for you. Even God himself in Deuteronomy chapter 5, before he gives the 10 commandments, he says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of a land of slavery. It seems that scripture gives us this track to run on, that in your present life, sometimes when it's hard to see the faithfulness of God, sometimes in the midst of my doubts and my fears, and maybe sometimes the anxiety of what's going to come and what's next, and how are we going to accomplish this, or how are we going to tackle this issue or this problem or whatever it might be, we get this track in scripture to run on from God himself in Deuteronomy 5, from the prophet Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 12, and then from David here in 1 Samuel chapter 17, that say, consider the ways that God has delivered me in the past. With the lion and with the bear, the ways that he delivered me in the past, that's why I'm confident that as I go to battle with this uncircumcised Philistine, that it's going to work out. And that's not to promise that everything is always going to work out for us. And yet, I think for sometimes in my life, I have a hard time seeing God's faithfulness in my present life, right here today. And yet when I look back, right, whether it's looking at a journal entry that I've written or looking back on a season of life that was difficult, it's much easier for me to see God's faithfulness and his hand at work in my life when I look in the rearview mirror. And I really think that scripture gives us that, and it gifts us with the ability to bank on his steadfastness when I'm having a hard time seeing it now. Would you do that today? Would you practice that today, Daily Doser, to really understand who God is and his steadfastness and his faithfulness? Sometimes we got to look into our past and say, consider all that he's done for me. Now I can move forward in confidence. Thanks, guys. We'll see you tomorrow.